All right. Thanks for joining me today. We'll be talking a little bit about disability awareness. Generally, I just like to start by encouraging you to reflect about what you know in general about disability. So, some of the things that we'll be covering today will include, what is disability? What kind of definitions are out there? What do different government agencies think about disability? What do different people with disabilities think about disability? What is that experience like? We'll also talk about something called different models of disability. These are different kind of frameworks that people use when it comes to approaching and understanding what disability is. And these models have existed throughout the ages, and different societies have different models of disability that they typically work from, as well as different people have models of disability that they work from. And this kind of impacts potentially legislation that's passed in different, countries, and that impacts how people in communities relate to people with disabilities. And it can sometimes even impact how families raise their kids with disabilities as well. We'll talk a little bit about medical aspects of disability. So just common things that go along with the experience of living with a disability and different disabilities. We'll cover a little bit about disability history and culture, some stuff around disability identity. What's that experiential piece for people living with disabilities? As well as the idea of what are some kind of disability related microaggressions. Just as like a baseline check-in, how comfortable are you with describing the concepts of disability? Any familiarity with different models of disability? What's that kind of knowledge, right, about like different kinds of disabilities or like chronic health conditions, right? Like diabetes versus, experiences with like mental health conditions. Are you familiar with any kind of disability or rehabilitation legislation in the United States? And how about are you confident, right, in your ability to communicate effectively with members of the disability community or different kind of disability cultures, right? All right, and we'll start with what I feel like is kind of appropriate, like what is disability? And it's important to say it's a really broad concept. A lot of governments around the world don't really agree fully on what is disability, how do we categorize it, how do we define it, and different bodies within the United States even have different ideas on what counts as a disability and who qualifies for disability related services. So typically, you can think of disability as like being based on the purpose and needs of a law, of an agency, or a country. So if you were ever interested in working in like a vocational rehabilitation context, defining disability within that framework might be helpful, right? So there needs to be a diagnosed disability or health condition. There needs to be an impact on different functional roles and capacities within life roles. And really importantly, someone needs to experience barriers to employment as a result of their disability. So now we'll talk just a little bit about kind of different organizational ideas around disability. So do you have any familiarity with like the Social Security Administration? No. Well, something that's important to know is that they're a federal agency that pays something called disability benefits to people if they have a long-term medical condition, right? So in order to qualify for these benefits, this Social Security Administration has a really strict view of, what counts as a disability and what, would impact one's ability to work to a point where they would qualify, right, for something like disability benefits. So what this administration looks at is the idea that a person can't do the work they did before, and this has to be due to some kind of health impact that not even standard accommodations can address. And this disability needs to last for at least a year or have the potential to result in death. So this is important to note that potentially someone doesn't have to be on, disability benefits for the duration of their lifetime, right? There's the ability to get off it potentially if they recover from their disability or they find ways to functionally reintegrate back into work. If someone's experienced a physical disability, right, and they worked as we'll say an auto mechanic, right, at a company somewhere. And maybe they've lost functions of their hands. Potentially maybe if the person was a bus driver, right? And they still had the ability to manipulate the steering wheel, they still had the ability to use their feet to, move the bus, they might not count as disabled in that way. But, someone who's an auto mechanic needs to be able to utilize their hands. They might qualify for kind of disability benefits, but more on perhaps a short term window, right? Where it would only last for 1 year or 2 years until they were able to function effectively. Someone who might have some kind of congenital, right? So at birth, someone maybe who's living with like a profound experience of cerebral palsy, right? They might qualify because they might not have the ability to engage in this kind of work. All right. So now we'll move on to our first little, very brief discussion around different laws within the United States about disabilities. So this is called the American Disabilities Act. This was passed in 1980. And this is kind of a landmark civil rights legislation. And it defines disability as the following. So it's a person who has physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more. A person who has a history or record of such an impairment would also count, or a person who is perceived by others as having such an impairment. So one thing that's kind of important to note here, right, is this idea of someone who's perceived by others is having such an impairment. This would be a situation like someone who's living with an intellectual or developmental disability, right? Where they might not assess themselves, right, as having a disability, right, of having kind of functional impact potentially. But, someone else who might make a neurological evaluation, right, who might have them do clinical testing, might identify that they are living with some kind of impairment. This would also count as someone, a person who has a history or record of such an impairment. So someone who might be going through the process of, a cancer survivor, right? Their experience of cancer might be in remission, but there's always the possibility that it can, reemerge, right? So they would still count as someone living with a disability. So it's also important to talk a little bit about disability as an identity, right? So different people who live with different kinds of disabilities have different relationships to disability, right? So a person who identifies as being disabled has their own kind of conceptualization of who they are outside of medical or legal definitions, right? And this can be especially important when it comes to the work you might do with people living with disabilities, because we'll soon talk about different models of disability. It's important to note that someone might be functioning from a social model of disability, right? Where they feel like the community that they live in is more disabling than whatever it is that they have to navigate. And that can be very different from someone who has a medical model of disability, where they think they just want to kind of fix what might be going on with them, or they might feel kind of broken. So it's really important that, whether you're working in a vocational rehabilitation space or in a clinical counseling space, just to be mindful of checking in with, how someone identifies, right? In trying to use potentially just before you find out how they like to be addressed, something called person first language, where you would say, an individual with autism, as opposed to identity first language, where you might say someone's autistic. So different people, as I said, kind of have different relationships to this terminology. I would recommend going with person first until directed otherwise, just because in a lot of scholarship and in a lot of different avenues, it's seen as a more appropriate way to address people living with disabilities. However, a lot of people living with disabilities have worked to reclaim certain terms. So like the deaf community, for example, has a really strong sense of kind of disability identity, oftentimes for people from that community, and they, kind of identify as capital D, deaf, right? They might have a strong cultural identity where they would prefer to be identified as a deaf person, as opposed to, an individual with, profound hearing loss or an individual who is deaf. And there's also different categories of disabilities. So all disabilities will fall into one of these four types, four categories. There are physical disabilities, developmental disabilities, sensory related disabilities, as well as psychiatric disabilities. So developmental disabilities, you can think of these that are, or as kinds of disabilities that are typically identified like in childhood, right? So oftentimes people living with intellectual disabilities, different developmental disabilities, they're identified early on, right? And they affect basically the development of a human being, right? Someone living with cerebral palsy might fall under kind of that developmental spectrum. It was kind of like a psychiatric one for cerebral palsy. But it's this idea of, kind of congenital things, things that might occur at birth, right? That impact a person's development through time. And I think we might even go a little bit more in depth in the different categories moving forward. And also psychiatric disabilities. So these are ones, right, as a counseling student, and you might have some more familiarity with, right? And I actually find that it can be surprising to a lot of people that a lot of psychiatric diagnoses count as disabilities. So generalized anxiety disorder, it's a disability, right? Social anxiety disorder would count. Major depressive disorder would count as a disability. Post-traumatic stress disorder would count as a disability. Those would all count, and potentially if you knew someone, here at the university who was having one of those experiences, they would qualify for services with student disability resources. They would essentially have access to those different services that might be provided under the law. All right, and then we actually have a chance to just go a little bit more in depth with each of the kinds, right? So physical disabilities kind of involve long-term or permanent impairments to the body's physical functions. So you can think of someone who might have lost like mobility in their legs, no longer able to walk. Someone who, temporary disabilities often fall in here. If you've ever broken your arm, broken your hand, right? That's it. It's a form of temporary disability, right? Where your ability to function has been significantly impaired for a period of time. There's also psychiatric disabilities. We talked a little bit more in depth about this before, but it refers to kind of a wide range of different behavioral or psychological concerns and problems. And these behaviors persist over time. They're not typically in response to a particular event, right? So something like maybe acute stress disorder might not count as a disability, right? But post-traumatic stress disorder would, looking at kind of this long-term experience, right? Someone living with a major depressive episode would counter persistent depressive disorder. These would all kind of fall under disabilities. There's also sensory related disabilities. Of course, these pertain to our five senses: sight, hearing, smell, touch, or taste. And of course, this is kind of crucial for our ability to function in the world. So if any of these are impacted in a long-term capacity, you fall under sensory disability. As well as developmental disabilities, which these are conditions that are usually present from birth and affect a person's cognitive, physical, or social development. So I think even potentially autism might count as a developmental disability, those sorts of experiences. It's also important to spend just a little bit of time talking about chronic pain that might coincide with the experience of disability, and sometimes on its own, right? And chronic pain is a pain that lasts for over 3 months. This pain can kind of be there all the time, or it can come and go in spurts, and it can happen anywhere in your body. It's also important to talk a little bit about this idea of chronic diseases and chronic illness. So chronic illness is the leading cause of disability and death in the United States. And you can think of chronic diseases as being kind of defined as conditions that last 1 or more years and requiring ongoing medical attention. These can have the potential to limit activities of daily living or both. So you can think of, I think diabetes would be a good one here, right, of a chronic disease, a chronic illness that can be really impactful if it's not well managed and can kind of result in a lot of kind of really negative outcomes potentially. So, it's important to note the disability ranges in severity. So two people with the same condition might be experiencing it very differently. So, just for example, missing one of your fingers as a result of an accident might be catastrophic if you're a musician, but it might not be as devastating if you worked as a school teacher. So this kind of experience of disability can be very different. All right. So now we're just going to have a very brief kind of check-in. So true or false? What qualifies as a disability is easily defined, and most United States government agencies use the exact same definition. I know fill in the blank can be challenging, but do you remember the four categories of disability we went over? And then true or false? Chronic illness is the leading cause of disability and death in America.